Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Paz and I am the CIO for Villa Maria Catholic Homes, or VMCH. Today I'm joined by my colleagues in aged care, Peter Corrigan, who is the General Manager of ICT at Mackenzie Aged Care Group in Victoria, and Troy Seidel, IT Manager at Eldercare in South Australia. We're going to be sharing our stories of our IT shared teams experiences, particularly in the context of the pandemic, and how it's enabled our organisations to respond to the changes that COVID brought with it. And in doing so, how it's transformed our organisations and the role and relationship that IT shared services teams has with those business areas. So to start off, Peter, do you want to explain a little bit about what services Mackenzie provides and the current structure? And then Troy, I'll ask you to do the same.
Yes, thank you, Maria. So Mackenzie Aged Care focuses on primarily residential aged care. We have a couple of residential villages to support independent living, but primarily it's residential. We have about 1,900 beds split across 17 homes. Those homes are located in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. 6 of the homes are in Victoria. So those were the ones that were primarily impacted in the pandemic. 2,300 staff, and that is all supported by a team of 8 technology members in my team. And that's split across service delivery, platform management, and application architecture. We also rely heavily on service partners and the relationships we've built with those over the years.
Excellent. Troy?
Yeah, so Eldercare is also in the aged care environment, looking after primarily, again, residential care. We do have some retirement living units where we sort of do the property services, the maintenance around some units, but they're pretty self-sufficient. The residents in those facilities, in those homes are quite independent still. We have about 950 residents across 11 facilities across regional and metro South Australia. Got about 1,500 staff all up, but that equates to about 850 full-time equivalents because it's typical, I think, in the aged care industry. Quite a lot of casual and part-time staff make up a large portion of the workforce. We cover everything at our residential facilities, so hospitality, cleaning, caring, lifestyle, nurses, nutrition, a whole bunch of stuff. Have a head office of about 80 people, covering all the back of house things, finance, procurement, HR, property services, and IT. Our IT team's about 10, but we do most of the things ourselves and don't need to rely on external parties too much.
Okay, and I'll just share, VMCH has been in operations for over a century. Our services include home, residential aged care, retirement living, affordable housing, disability, and also specialist education. We have approximately 2,400 employees and over 400 plus volunteers. And they provide services 7 days a week in over 50 locations across Victoria and New South Wales. We have a hybrid IT shared services model where we have a similar to yourself, Troy and Peter, small number of dedicated IT staff, but we also have managed services or outsourcing arrangements with really close partners. So that's basically our structure from a shared services perspective. But let's start, and let's start talking about a little bit about the impact felt from COVID-19 on care and just how immediate that impact was. And I'll just start by sharing, and I guess lots of sectors and organisations felt that, where the need for digital working, socialising and learning almost needed to happen. That transition almost needed to happen overnight. And, you know, during the lockdowns, I think it would be fair that across many sectors, people looked at how they could transition their corporate workforce and education online. And that had impacts for us, particularly in aged care, around responding to a lot of the government mandates that were being and directions that were being sort of put forward to keep our the people that we look after safe and connected. And I know from VMCH's perspective, the move to Office 365 and telehealth and the deployment of laptops and Wi-Fi became paramount to actually responding and enabling to that immediate need. But I would love to hear about what some of your experiences were. So, Peter, what were the immediate impacts felt by Mackenzie that your teams needed to enable?
I think overnight we had a huge workforce problem. The workforce in aged care is typically a shared model in itself, where a worker could have 2 or 3 different jobs, and they could work in different facilities that we have, but also different aged care operators. And of course, all that came to a halt during the pandemic. So we also had the people who were worried about catching COVID and didn't want to come into a facility, which also caused a knock-on impact. Getting agency staff was challenging, very, very expensive. So we were lucky. We had homes in the other 2 states. So I mentioned Queensland and New South Wales. So leveraging the technology, we managed to enable access to the clinical system by those other homes to be able to provide that remote support. That was pretty much done straight away. And then we had to find technology such as laptops, digital devices, tablets, mobile phones, get them in, get them configured, get them sent out to the facilities. Now, not wanting to have to rely on Australia Post, we ended up hiring Uber drivers to collect those devices and take them out to the homes that we knew that they were delivered. Our service delivery team was creating documentation and how-to guides that went along with those devices. So it was a challenge, but we learned an awful lot, and yeah, interesting. One other thing we had was we couldn't get our hands on agency staff, and we struggled to get the right skill sets. We couldn't get clinical staff. So we had to pivot and think, how can we fill the gap? Our HR manager came up with a fantastic idea. She managed to get hold of a load of Qantas staff who are displaced by the pandemic. So we managed to put them in, heavily customer focused, and we enabled them to keep the residents occupied, happy, content, while we enabled the clinical staff to run around and make sure that they delivered the care.
Yeah. I think that was an experience shared by VMCH as well, just that whole need to find staff, particularly under that government requirement, which made a lot of sense to have staff working on one site. And I recall distinctly that we had to develop reporting using our business intelligence tools and feeding in different data sets from across our rostering systems to ensure that we had people only working across one site, and where we could optimise that resourcing to make sure that we weren't having to bear additional costs but continue to deliver those services. Troy, I'd imagine, sorry, Peter.
I was just going to say, I think that's actually made us or put us in a stronger position after the event, simply because we've rationalised all the people who were doing multiple shifts, and we've actually been able to give local staff members to that facility more shifts, or even turn them full-time rather than a casual arrangement or a part-time arrangement. So looking back, it was a challenge definitely for everyone, but I think we've come out of this a lot stronger than when we went in.
Yeah. So Troy, I'd imagine the experience was a little bit different in South Australia, or was it the same?
Look, South Australia obviously had a much easier time of it than Victoria. But a lot of the same issues occurred in South Australia too. So, we were also subject to the one worker, one site. And so that immediately, started people going, well, who is working where? And so we had to do like you were doing and pull out information from our rostering systems and other systems to work out who was working well. And as Peter was saying, with this workforce being quite casual and part-time, they often do have multiple shifts for multiple organisations and multiple sites. So we had to talk to all of our staff and go, look, are you working for us or are you working for somebody else? And then work out which shifts people could do. So I know during the time period there was a fair bit of overtime going on because you just had to find people wherever you could and ask people to work extra when it was hard to find someone. We did work very heavily with our agency organisations that provide additional stuff, but they had to also lock into the one worker, one site. So it became quite difficult there. We also looked at what was going on in Victoria and where there was outbreaks in aged care facilities, and we sort of planned for a surge workforce. We understood that when an outbreak occurred, then your staffing problems escalated through the roof because you had people that were staff that had to isolate, or they had COVID, or as Peter was saying, they didn't want to go to work because there was a COVID outbreak and they didn't want to catch it. So, we had to put a whole bunch of reports in place so that we could hand information to people that might be coming in cold, information about our residents and what their needs were, because they wouldn't have known how to use our clinical systems, etc., etc. So, that was a fair challenge, and we had head office staff. We identified head office staff that had nursing qualifications or other qualifications, and as the IT manager even said, look, I can chop vegetables if you need me to chop vegetables. I can at least do that. So, staffing was a major concern here as well.
And I guess, some of the other requirements that were imposed by the government around keeping track of who was coming in, keeping track of where they'd been, etc. So all of those digital sign-in requirements and QR code, temperature checking was also part of the mix. And again, our IT teams needed to respond to all of those requirements. That was certainly a big undertaking for us, given the number of sites that we had to, service that need for. And, each site had their own, some needed more information, and some could rely simply on the Service Vic QR code. What was that experience like for you, Peter?
So I think obviously we pushed out all these new digital devices, and sending them out with a how-to guide is good, but what they really want is someone at the end of a telephone line to talk to. So they would call into the service desk, and we managed to enable all of those operators to be able to remotely connect and control the device. So they'd be on a tablet, and let's say the chef was there, he wanted to put his weekly order in to make sure we had bread, milk and all the food delivered for the following week. And if there was any issues around that procurement, we could just connect to it remotely, talk them through the problem or the issue and resolve it for them there and then. And that was the most important. They didn't have to wait or phone back. It was a case of doing it there and then, because we had so many requests of the service delivery team. It wasn't time to go back and deal with it later.
Yeah, indeed. And I certainly had a very similar experience. It really brought the IT team to the fore. What about yourself, Troy?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different stages there. When there was screening going on, Eldercare did a lot of that manually because the conditions were changing daily, weekly. There was different times that people would come and different conditions and different things around temperature checking. So we were doing that manually and adding extra staff into the equation to do that. But when our sites needed to lock right down, that's when sort of IT team went into overdrive, so to speak, because we needed to keep residents in contact with people. their family members, doctors, whatever else it might be, because they were effectively stuck there and couldn't get out, and people couldn't come to see them. So, we madly identified devices and got hold of iPads and Android devices and set them all up so that they were super simple to use. Set up all the accounts, all the apps that needed to be done, your Skype and your FaceTime and that sort of thing. And then created some very quite simple user guides about how to use these, both for our staff and for our residents, because some of our staff weren't using those sort of apps on a regular basis, and got those out to sites. So I think we might talk later on, but procurement was a major factor, a major problem, because everybody wanted all these same things at the same time. So we were lucky enough to see the writing on the wall and get in early, and for our staff that had to work at home, get in extra monitors and get in cameras and headsets, and these iPads and devices for residents. So good relationships with suppliers was pretty crucial.
And there was that challenge around PPE as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't just trying to source technology, it was trying to source a good supply of PPE.
Yeah. So, face masks, hand sanitizers. I think, Peter, you talked, when we talked previously that, you had meeting rooms full of stuff that you were trying to get hold of so that we had enough. And we had the same thing. I think our poor procurement manager probably didn't sleep for 3 weeks. But again, we had very good relationships with suppliers, and that was crucial. Without those relationships with suppliers, we didn't have good agreements in place. They probably would have, got the equipment or stuff to somebody else.
Yeah, I'd have to say we had a very similar experience at BMCH, where it was really through partnerships that we were able to ensure that our residents remain connected with their loved ones, whether they were in a residential facility or at home. So a good example is we were using UMPS Health sensors to be able to do monitoring at a distance for carers and for family members whilst their loved one was locked in their homes effectively. And in a similar fashion, we had, or in our residential sites, we also had a partnership with YourLink, who we called it Technology at Home, and they help train up some of the people we care for who aren't necessarily digitally literate and savvy on how to do the basic things on a laptop or a Surface Pro or even a phone. And that was an absolute godsend, because that actually kept them connected, and in some cases even more connected than they ever had been through the use of email, etc. So, Peter, can you tell us about, how do you go about training a workforce or enabling people who haven't had to use these technologies before?
It's the network, or the wireless network, which joins and gels all these devices together, and so that has to be stable no matter what. But the aged care workforce starts very young, when people are starting out on their career, and it goes all the way to the people who have retired and they've come back as a volunteer. And what we find is that the younger generation just, they know the technology inside out, as you would expect. The older generation, they struggle with it a little bit. So, we had the concept of the young helping the old get on board with the technology so that they can become familiar with it. And that extended through the workforce, but it also extended out to the residents. So we had, obviously, infection control is paramount in a facility. So the number of times you actually have to wipe down technology is just crazy. So we had people there just dedicated to wipe down surfaces. Perfect example would be time and attendance. When you start your shift, we have a biometric reader, you put your fingerprint on it. That's got to be wiped down in between every single person who puts their finger on that between shifts. And it goes for keyboards, tablet devices, the whole range. So it was when we couldn't find those skill sets for clinical, we just found people who could help and support the facilities to deliver the care.
What about yourself, Troy?
Yeah, look, we get all of those similar sorts of issues here, probably not quite as to the same degree as Victoria. But, you know, I think one of the silver linings from a technology perspective is that people had to. So, you know, we used we try to make things as simple as possible and provide simple one-sheet laminated guides that could go out with devices. But even, you know, head office staff, you know, we're on Office 365 and we've been encouraging people to use Teams and a few things like that for you know, 12 months, 18 months. And, you know, quite often people wouldn't sign in and that sort of stuff. As soon as the lockdowns occurred, overnight, just changed. Everybody was on Teams every minute of the day. And the adoption, you know, once people get started, they quickly work it out for themselves, you know, that office sort of worker. And that's carried right through. So now everybody starts Teams up, or it starts up automatically for them. They're on Teams, they'll use the chat feature. They will do a video call, whereas in the past, you know, people wouldn't get on the camera if they didn't have to. They'd rather do a phone call or something like that. So, you know, it's been a real sort of silver lining from a technology perspective, the embracing of technology and people going, oh, actually, this is really good. I didn't realise I could do all this. So that was quite cool, really.
I totally agree with that. And so, you know, a huge hive of activity during the pandemic for the IT team. What kind of impact did that pace have on your teams, and how did you respond to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure it'll be a different story from Victoria, but you know, we had a period of time where head office workers working from home. Naturally, our staff at sites have to work at sites because that's where our residents are and that's where they're looking after them. But, you know, people, I think we were concerned about how much productivity people would have and those sort of things. We actually found productivity went up. You know, people didn't have the commute time. Their PCs and monitors were sitting there and, you know, perhaps where they shouldn't have, they'd jump on it. They'd get an email at 7 and jump on at 7 o'clock at night and I'll just sort this out now or do something, which was, you know, in one way really good because we sort of needed all that extra attention for a short period of time. But you start to worry about people's mental health and what's going to happen down the track. You know, in South Australia, we only had a period where we were working from home, and because our staff at sites couldn't work from home, we wanted to bring people back into the office, at head office, as soon as we could to sort of send the right message. And so we only had a small period, but very interested to see with yourself and Peter how the experiences where that was a long term and how that affected people.
Yeah, listen, I think, you know, the technology teams are used to working long hours, big projects to get innovations implemented for the business to use, but that typically has a start and an end date. And through the pandemic, obviously we had the start date, but there was no end in sight. So the teams were just working all the hours that they possibly could. And after a couple of weeks, there was still no end in sight. So it was a case of making sure that they were doing okay. You helped with the workload. You put some rules around not starting too early and not finishing too late. But also when you call your staff to check in, not so much a work call, but a personal call to say, how are you doing? How are you coping? Is there anything that I can do to support you at home? We also sent, you know, hampers just to say thank you. You're doing a great job out there. So yeah, it was tough, but also a moment where teams came together and delivered exceptional work and change to organisations to help transform.
Yeah, indeed, that was certainly our experience, and I think you could see it on their faces, couldn't you, Peter, when they were tired and exhausted. And I think ongoing communication played the critical role there, just keeping all the teams informed. And we stood up regular stand-ups, daily stand-ups, just to keep everyone coming together to make sure we were sharing ideas and helping each other and supporting each other. In a similar fashion, our CEO, Sonia Smart, ran these smart live casts where she kept the organisation up to date. We used SMS messaging to keep the families of our residents up to date. So communication played a critical role, I think,
Absolutely.
in maintaining that healthy mindset and balance. I do recall actually saying to my teams, please have a break in between the day and make sure you're logging off. You had to reinforce some of that because they were all, just working so hard and so heavily. But in that, I think they, the role of the team and the perception held by the business certainly shifted, didn't it? So how do you think the relationship between the business and the IT teams has changed as a consequence of the pandemic?
Listen, I think technology is now more front and center. The service delivery team are asked, well, because they delivered so well during the pandemic and they were the go-to people for so many different things around technology, that's continued through. So whereas I think technology was seen as issuing a laptop every now and again and resetting a password, it's turned that around to saying, well, technology can enable us. It can get rid of the paper trail. It can take us through to a new world, a new opportunity.
Yeah, Troy?
I think at Eldercare, perhaps being a smaller organisation and having one head office where there's 80 odd people, which is everyone by name, including the CE and the executives and the like. We've always had a pretty good relationship. I think this is COVID again as another silver lining has really enhanced that and shown that the value. I think it's easier to have conversations around IT now, and looking at and suggesting things and looking at things that can be done in the future. Those conversations are listened to perhaps a little more than they were in the past. And I think it's interesting. We've sort of the new normal has sort of changed a little bit too with the working at home. I think prior to COVID, a lot of managers were like, no, I can't have people work from home. I don't know what they're going to be up to and what they're doing. And now it's quite common that if someone needs to, build out a piece of work or really focus on something, that they spend the day at home or a couple of days at home getting that piece of work done. So it's interesting how things sort of have changed into this new normal. But yeah, certainly having the conversation around technology is easier, and certainly a lot of focus. I think we might talk about cyber security in a minute. There's certainly a lot of focus around things like cyber security too.
Yes, well, we definitely saw a change, and probably because of the increasing amount of cyber activity that was occurring during the lockdown. It seemed to be an opportunity that actors took advantage of. Did that influence your strategies? I know we had a much greater level of focus in terms of, building our staff security awareness, making sure that they were educated on phishing attacks, making sure we were prepared to respond to any incidents, etc. So did that change your strategies in a similar vein, Peter?
Absolutely. So we deprioritized a couple of projects last year to bring cybersecurity forward, especially with the changing workforce, having that remote support. We didn't have confidence who was connecting to the network where and when. So we invested heavily in cybersecurity last year, and also, as you were saying, invested in the human element, which is the training, the awareness. Don't click on this link, don't offer any information voluntarily without verifying it's a genuine source. So I think as we've enabled access, so that people find it easier to provide that remote support, it's also brought into question who can access what data and what audit trails you have around people accessing that data and what happens to it, so its life cycle. that's what we've been focusing on.
Yeah. And so how do you think the roles changed for technology in the sector, Troy? Do you think that it's sort of moved from more of a service provider, if you like, to more of an enabler and more part of enabling strategies for the business? Is that where you see it?
No, absolutely. I think, we've often been seen in the past as just a service or, back of house activity. Certainly now with boards and executives looking at ways that IT can enable the business to achieve things. We've put together, as probably many organisations have an IT strategy around, making sure we leverage the data that we have, good data governance around that, start to get a bit more advanced, look at automation and artificial intelligence to see what we can gain out of those sort of areas. It's still difficult. I mean, I think we all know that the aged care sector, and we're a not-for-profit in the aged care sector, it isn't greatly funded. The Royal Commission highlighted that there is perhaps underfunding within the segment. So you've got to find creative ways to achieve some of these things, because you can't just keep adding particularly ongoing costs into the business by adding this bit of software or that bit of software. So, we're doing some work around cybersecurity and putting in a new system, but we had to find sort of ways we could reduce things elsewhere or change things around. Peter mentioned canning a couple of projects to make cyber happen. So it's still difficult. I think most organisations in this sort of industry can struggle just to break even. So
Troy, just pick up on the investment into the business. We had to keep a very close eye on occupancy throughout all of the pandemic. We can't allow occupancy to drop too low because that's revenue. And of course, during the pandemic, families didn't feel confident to put their loved ones in a home. Lots of close attention to the occupancy levels across the business.
Yeah. And do you find that's influencing your technology strategy, like the need to invest more in, as Troy said, AI, automation, sensors, etc., like more sort of those types of
absolutely
monitoring controls? Yeah.
I think, the investment in technology has been seen to work, in a very short space of time, that transformation. So we have the interest, we have the momentum from the workforce. So the appetite's there. We just now need to business case and work through the next set of innovations we want to bring through. So that technology is that enabler to our future.
Yeah. And, Troy, you mentioned the findings of the recent Royal Commission, certainly adding to that momentum and the weight to transform for the sector, and also the 17 billion investment that the federal government has recently announced. How do you think the recent experience of your teams and these announcements might help to position technology to respond to the ask?
Yeah, look, I think firstly, I think our team is very resilient. I think probably any of the IT teams that have gone through COVID and worked in aged care are pretty resilient people. So, that's a great starting point. That you've got people that are adaptable, flexible. I think, with the Royal Commission, there's, as well as the extra funding, there's also a lot of requirements that go along with that. So, there's a whole bunch of increased mandatory reporting and a whole bunch of other things. And so there's going to be a big demand on IT and parts of the business to be able to provide the information that the government is looking for around those. So it's going to be an interesting time going forward. But I think most of us have got teams that are really good at adapting and changing and moving fast in a lot of areas, which is pretty key to a lot of it.
Do you think we need to bring new skills in